Right, so hello and welcome to this fourth Freeths Green Breakfast in the series on EV charging. If you weren't able to join us for the first three, the previous instalments covered back in May an insight into the electric vehicle sector, where we heard the views and practical experiences of industry experts. Then in July, we covered financing EV charging infrastructure, and in September, we had a session on how to deliver a successful EV project. We were taken through charging infrastructure and electric fleet case studies. So each of the previous instalments were recorded, and links to go back and watch them can be found on our Low Emission Vehicles webpage, and there's a link to that on your invite. So today's Green Breakfast is on the subject of low emission vehicle technologies, and we're going to hear from first Natasha Patel of Baringa Partners, who's going to give us an overview of the low emission vehicle technologies currently available in the market and those on the horizon. Claire Weiller of PRE Power Developers will take a more in-depth look at smart charging and vehicle to grid, and then our own data protection partner, Luke Dixon, will cover the legal aspects of data in the context of EV charging. So a couple of housekeeping points just before we start. Today's session will be recorded and we'll send you a link so that you can watch the presentations again. If you have questions, please do send us questions. Can you use the Q&A button at the foot of your screen, not the chat button, but the Q&A button, and we'll put your questions to our speakers at the end of the presentations. If we run out of time, we'll collate the questions and send you answers at the same time as we send you the recording link to the presentations and a copy of the slides. There'll also be poll questions for you to answer as we go through, the first of which you should already have had on your screens. So now may I introduce our first speaker, Natasha Patel of Baringa Partners. Over to you, Natasha.
Thank you, Kristen, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to quickly share my screen. This morning, I'm hoping to talk you through the low emission vehicle technologies that we're seeing in the market. And obviously, it's worth saying that these technologies are sort of a part of the overall technology landscape within the low emission vehicle space. We've also got infrastructure technologies. We've also got sort of energy innovation technologies. And I know that sort of Claire later in the program is going to cover some of that as well. But what I'm going to focus on for this session is around the vehicles themselves and the various different alternative drivetrains and vehicles that are there that can help to reduce the carbon impact that you might be having either personally, as a business, or as a fleet. So to get us started, it's sort of worth saying the overall view that Baringa holds is that cars and light commercial vehicles are likely to electrify in order to achieve zero emissions, but heavy goods vehicles are a little bit more challenging at this point. And I think we probably see a range of technology options that may suit different fleets and different operators' requirements over time. I thought that it might be helpful to give an overview of the various different implications of each of these technology types. So the carbon savings that come from it, what kind of suitability they have, what kind of supporting infrastructure is required, where the energy sort of will come from and what considerations you might need to have, and some potential economic implications of them as well. So one of the simplest things that sort of any sort of fleet or business can do, or individual, is to look at whether their vehicles could be more aerodynamic and therefore fuel efficient and therefore have carbon efficiencies. This is especially true for heavy goods vehicles, where sort of typically tractors and trailers can kind of be quite, can be made to be quite aerodynamic, either in the shape of their trailers or through sort of trailer skirts or through roof tapering and various other aerodynamic technologies. You could also have elements like reduced amount of tires resistance and rolling resistance, or sort of tire pressure systems that can make sure that, again, your carbon emissions are reduced. So existing diesel vehicles could basically be improved so that you have a more fuel efficient and lower carbon impact from your heavy goods vehicles. They could give carbon savings of nearly 2 to 10% today. They're not very capex intensive. They can be quite easy to install, especially if you align it to your lease cycle, and there shouldn't be any impact to your existing operations, and you don't require any additional infrastructure, obviously, because it's still your diesel vehicles, and you could have a really positive economic impact because obviously your fuel efficiency improves, so you can kind of have nearly 30% fuel efficiency, and an overall total cost of ownership is positive because your costs kind of reduce overall, even with the additional investment that you might make for those trailers, etc. So quite a simple solution at this point that can easily be put into place, especially for heavy goods vehicles. The second sort of vehicle type I'm going to talk about is, or alternative fuel type is going to be biofuels or synthetic fuels. These can sort of work within the, again, existing vehicles that you might have, whether they're light commercial vehicles or heavy goods vehicles, and can have quite a significant impact on the CO2. You will require obviously tailored refueling, or to think about where you'll be procuring your biofuel from, because it's not as readily available as obviously petrol and diesel are today, but because you're still using a petrol or a diesel vehicle, it doesn't impact your duty cycles. You can continue to use your vehicles like you do today. There are impacts in terms of sourcing, because the production of those biofuels and the supply chain can be tricky. Sometimes there's land that is used for some of the production of those biofuels. If they're synthetically produced, then it's about how do you source them, how do you get arrangements sort of with those suppliers to make sure that you have the refueling infrastructure and requirements that you need. But it can definitely be done. There are producers and suppliers that will help you to think through how they can get you the sort of fuel that you need for the vehicles that you need. And overall, it could definitely lead to lower efficiency. There's lower costs, and also to lower your carbon impact as a whole as well. These could be sort of again, solutions where it would work with your existing vehicle. Most vehicles are compatible with biofuels and synthetic fuels. In some instances, you might have to change your vehicle as well. But again, can be sort of a good solution if you're looking to reduce the carbon impact of your fleet and of your business. The second option I'm going to look at is third option, sorry, is full hybrid. So full hybrid vehicles are very well known by most people. They're for cars as well. So like the Toyota Prius, for example, you have your a lot of your light commercial vehicles, and you can also get heavy goods vehicles that are hybrids. They can give about a 10% CO2 benefit. So obviously they still have a drivetrain that is both diesel or petrol, so combustion engine, alongside a battery as well that can be used. That's predominantly sort of regenerative braking that sort of provides that benefit. But it can lead to, again, pretty significant fuel efficiencies, nearly 60%, but there is a higher upfront cost, obviously, to replace the vehicle that you currently have with the new drivetrain. Don't require any additional infrastructure because you can still run that vehicle on petrol and diesel. This is, of course, a full hybrid, which means that it never gets plugged in, and so your fuel is the same as well. So again, little impact on your overall operations, and a decent impact on your carbon benefit. So not the perfect solution, but definitely a good intermediate solution for a lot of fleet operators and businesses. Then we've got gas and biomethane. So gas is sort of, there's vehicles, both light commercial, medium and heavy goods vehicles that can be gas vehicles. It is a completely different engine, but they do provide a comparable range and payload in a lot of instances. So a gas or a biomethane vehicle will do what your current combustion engine vehicle does, both in terms of distance as well as in the amount of weight that they can carry. The carbon impact, obviously, from the two is different. So if you're using natural gas, actually, there's not much of a carbon benefit. There is about 10 to 30%, but biomethane makes a huge, significant difference of nearly 85% benefit from carbon. You again obviously will require dedicated refueling facilities and a network for access to biomethane. And we've seen quite a few delivery fleets. John Lewis comes to mind at the moment, and Waitrose, who have installed biomethane refueling facilities at their depots and can use that for their heavy goods vehicles. And they intend to convert a lot of their heavy goods vehicles towards biomethane over time. It does therefore require that national production and distribution infrastructure. But again, I think biomethane producers or natural gas supply chain is slightly better established, and you can sort of definitely, if you were to be proactive around it, ensure that you have the supply and the distribution network that you need for your vehicles as they travel not only across UK but also into Europe. There's quite a good penetration of gas network and vehicles into Europe as well for transport. These vehicles obviously are more expensive up front. They do have lower energy density, and biomethane can also be expensive. So overall, the economics are not great. But indeed, businesses that have been determined on making an impact onto their carbon emissions as a business, as an operator, as a fleet operator, have found biomethane to be a good solution to enable them to do that. And a business case that is sort of more long-term focused has obviously gone through for a number of different companies, and it can be developed and done. I don't see much of penetration, obviously, for gas into vehicles, light vehicles, like passenger vehicles at all. We've then got the full battery electric vehicles. This is what we really see in the cars today. Battery electric vehicles would obviously be manufacturers like Tesla. You've also got plug-in hybrid vehicles, which would fall in here, where you are able to use the battery only for a reasonable distance, and you can recharge it, which means that your reliance on petrol and diesel can fall, and I'd put that in this category. Like I said, we definitely expect cars and light commercial vehicles to transition towards this technology. For medium and heavy goods vehicles, I think the technology is still under development. We've obviously got the Tesla Semi and a couple of other sort of demonstrator vehicles from indeed Mercedes and others, but broadly those vehicles are still very much in concept and development stage. Huge carbon impact, of course, and yes, there's various sort of reports you can read about the well-to-wheel carbon impact versus point-of-use carbon impact. But fundamentally, even on a well-to-wheel basis, electric drivetrains have a huge carbon impact compared to combustion engine vehicles when you compare the well-to-wheel life cycle of those vehicles. Charging infrastructure is indeed required for private users. Obviously, home charging can solve a large amount of their charging needs. And if you're a business, then in your workplace or in your depots, installing charging infrastructure on land you own is also much easier. Access to public charging is required in many instances, and that is definitely improving. The government has set out an ambition to have nearly 6,000 public rapid chargers on all of the strategic road network by 2030, and I think 3,000 or so by 2025. So we're definitely looking at an acceleration in public charging network to be able to support both private and business use for battery electric vehicles. There is a significant increase in power requirements, and so whether it is your house or whether it is your business, it would definitely be worthwhile to explore your energy strategy on the back of a transition of any of your vehicles, whether that's looking at EV tariffs, whether that's looking at whether you require battery on site, it's looking at the grid capacity requirements, and what you can do in terms of charging technologies to reduce your bill. So things like smart charging, where you can reduce the impact of your power requirements by optimizing the way you charge. Many fleets, especially because of clean air zones, will find electric vehicles to be at total cost of ownership parity. You definitely have high upfront costs, but you'll have lower operating costs because electric vehicles are much cheaper to operate, with electricity being much cheaper to generate and use. And if that is obviously green or renewable energy, then more so your impact in terms of your carbon impact. For purchase prices of individual vehicles, so if you're looking to sort of, buy your next car, and obviously an electric vehicle is probably falling in the more like the 40 or the 60 grand range rather than the 20-25 grand range, which is the average vehicle sort of purchase price in the UK today, then we expect that price to come closer together. It's already moved down a lot more in the last year or so, but it's going to move even more so sort of by 2022 and 2023, where you can actually, for a similar price, get a combustion engine vehicle and a fully electric vehicle, and the decision would be a lot easier, we would expect. And then finally, I'm just going to touch on hydrogen. Hydrogen is being talked about a lot in terms of its use case, not just for transport, but also in energy. And I think that's where hydrogen could be really powerful for us medium to long term, when we start to explore how we can use hydrogen for both energy as well as transport. It is definitely still under development. You've got a large number of manufacturers looking at exploring what use hydrogen can have, and that's predominantly more for the heavy goods vehicles than for the light commercial, light duty vehicles, because light duty vehicles, as I mentioned, once they go electric and their charging infrastructure is put in, it's kind of a lot of investment has already been sunk into that technology. And so where we expect hydrogen to emerge is probably more on the heavy goods side. And obviously that it can have a huge impact on the CO2 benefit, especially if you're generating green hydrogen rather than blue hydrogen, so renewable hydrogen rather than hydrogen that's being generated from dirty electricity. You do require, again, dedicated refueling facilities, and these can be quite cumbersome. It's whether you generate the hydrogen at site or whether hydrogen is generated elsewhere and then transported to site. And so the supply chain implications are fairly complex, and you therefore require a national production and distribution infrastructure to get the hydrogen to the locations you need it at. The likelihood is that hydrogen will mimic what we have with petrol and diesel, where you go to a refueling station as opposed to having anything at home. And there are very high upfront costs at the moment and refueling costs at the moment to be able to sustain any sort of a hydrogen fleet. But it is the predominant technology we expect for heavy goods vehicles in the more longer term to have a proper impact on our carbon emissions, because as you can see from the other technologies above, we don't quite get the same carbon impact that we need to get towards zero emissions over time. So a quick whistle-stop tour. There's a lot of research, of course, in this space, but hopefully got you a good introduction towards the various zero-emission vehicle technologies that are out there and the direction of travel that we see for each of those technologies. So thank you very much, and looking forward to the other speakers.
Thank you, Natasha. There's one question that's been posted. Does the circa 95% CO2 benefit for BEVs include their manufacture?
Yes, so it completely depends. It can absolutely, that specifically relates to the point of use, but absolutely, if you take well-to-wheel, like I mentioned, there is still a significant carbon benefit between combustion engine and battery electric. Probably not fully 95. It depends on where that manufacturing is happening. If it's in Germany or in UK, where the grid is automatically getting decarbonized over time, then it would be a lot better. If you're producing in Eastern Europe, where the grid is still predominantly carbon intensive, then of course the carbon benefit is not as much, but the 95% is definitely for point of use.
Thank you very much. So thank you, Natasha. You've had a poll question on your screens. I think most of you have, looking at the percentages, I think most of you have had a chance to answer that. So I'm going to hand over now to Claire Weiller. Over to you, Claire.
Okay, hello. Let me start it from the beginning. Hi, good morning, everyone. I trust that you can see my screen. My name is Claire Weiller, and I'm VP of Business Development at PRE, Power Research Electronics, which I'll tell you more about in a minute. And the topic of the talk today is smart charging and vehicle to grid. So it's a deep dive on a specific technology related to electric vehicles, and how it helps integrate electric vehicles in the grid. I'll be looking at key questions, starting with what are they? What are the benefits of smart charging in V2G? And what are the barriers to adoption today? For a bit of background on my perspective on this subject, PRE is a hardware manufacturer that supplies V2G charge points. And previously, I've worked at a software aggregator company specialized in V2G called Nuvi. Right. But first, as not everyone is familiar with PRE, here are some quick facts. So PRE are a Dutch technology R&D company. You can actually see their headquarters on my background screen, that started over 30 years ago with the development of power electronics. And we started developing components for EV charging stations, more specifically around 10 years ago. And one of the earliest main customers was ABB on their 50 kilowatt charger. And eventually, PRE was being asked more and more by customers to build around the core components until we ended up making full charging stations as white label manufacturers. This year, PRE joined the Waterland Private Equity Investments Group, which provides it with resources to expand its development of DC chargers, ranging from 6 kilowatts up to high power 350 kilowatts. And with the Waterland investment, we became partners with Heliox, who's also part of that group. And the combined turnover for both companies is around 50 million euros, and there's around 150 people working for them. So you get an idea of the scale. The Heliox and PRE specialties are complementary. PRE technologies are all DC charging focused, with V2G and high power charging being core applications. So our customers who we supply to are charge point networks, for example, and V2G software players. So V2G is really not all that we do, and in terms of market presence, we've estimated recently that PRE technologies are present in about 40% of DC public and semi-public chargers in Europe today. And our partner Heliox is the #1 electric bus charging manufacturer. They develop turnkey projects and provide solutions to municipalities and bus operators, for example, as they go electric. And today they're managing 240 megawatts of electric bus load across Europe and globally. So how have we been involved in the V2G market at PRE? In the UK, PRE are part of the largest residential vehicle to grid trial that's run by OVO Energy. And this trial has to date around 300 chargers installed in the field at customers' homes. We supplied core technology to that project. We've also partnered with other of the largest manufacturers of V2G chargers, such as the ones shown here on the bottom left is the official Nissan vehicle to grid charger. And on the right is a charger that also contains PRE technologies that's used by Shell and their CPO company NewMotion in Dutch projects. So a bit of an introduction to start at the very beginning about what is vehicle to grid and what is smart charging. Smart charging generally refers to the rescheduling of an EV's charge to a better time, for example, to avoid peak prices or to avoid overloading the grid at certain peak times. V2G is the next level up from smart charging, where the vehicle can not just avoid peak periods, but it can also send power back to the grid or to the local home or building, and is in effect being used as a battery storage device. The technologies underpinning both V2G and smart charging, just to give an idea of how it works, are a combination of hardware and software. The hardware is mainly inside the charge point, and it needs to be controlled by a software layer, as you can see on the diagram. Smart charging actually can be done on virtually any vehicle via the charger. But for V2G, however, the vehicle needs to be designed specifically to allow two-way power flows back to outside of the vehicle. The software layer is generally the business of an aggregator or a utility, and it takes inputs from lots of different sources, and with optimization algorithms, it decides the best time and the best charge power levels to charge and discharge the vehicle. So these variables, the inputs might be the local energy tariff, it might be the wholesale energy price, it might be a forecast of renewable energy generation on the grid or locally. could be the grid frequency or local congestion on grid networks. And last, but probably most importantly, the driver's schedule for when they next need the vehicle. So V2G technology allows second-by-second control of the EV, and it values EV batteries as storage resources. So why is this so important? Well, the chart in the middle here is a good illustration of why. It shows the duck curve. So this is a graph of the net load in California. So it's the load on the electricity system that's left after wind and solar energy are accounted for. And this chart shows how that net load evolves over the years. And it's shaped like a duck, that's the name, but it highlights a number of problems that are growing on the electricity system. Because as wind and solar energy become more widely adopted, and particularly solar, they start covering a very high share of total demand on the grid during the day. This is good news for renewable energy and low CO2 emissions, but it causes huge issues for ramping up and down other conventional power plants at the beginning of the day and at the end of the day. And these are issues both in terms of system stability and costs, because there are large costs to conventional power plants to ramp. And then this, the evening peak demand at the end of the day, that effect is also exacerbated by electric vehicles coming onto the system and coming online on the network right at the time as well, where the sun has dropped off at the end of the day. So California is having to turn on the equivalent of 13 gigawatts of power over 3 hours at the end of the day to mitigate these new trends. And 13 gigawatts is equivalent to, as you see here, 13 nuclear reactors, 4,300 wind turbines, or 1.3 million electric vehicles that could start discharging their batteries and providing power back as support. So really, EVs in combination with renewables can be a very risky combination for the grid, but if they're managed in the right way and with vehicle-to-grid and smart charging to a lesser extent, they can not only mitigate the problem, but actually help really solve it and reduce it. So for example, coming back to the UK, National Grid estimates that in the future, when EVs become much more widespread, in the years between 2030 and 2050, EVs in V2G mode will actually be able to help reduce the overall national peak demand. So they'll have a negative contribution to peak in the system in 20 years' time. So V2G, I'll refer to V2G, but it also includes smart charging. V2G delivers benefits at various levels in the system, and it delivers benefits in two forms. One is explicit revenues that come from market participation of electric vehicles, and the other one is savings directly on end users' energy bills. The revenues come from markets that generally are for transmission system operators. So EVs can provide balancing services, frequency response services to capacity markets, potentially in the future. And that really helps stabilize the transmission level network, but also at the distribution system level. For example, if a local transformer is overly congested, EVs can come online and help support that. On the behind the meter side, this is probably the most immediate short-term important stream of benefits because they come directly to the end user. So it can be through various benefits, so time of use optimization, or reducing a demand charge on an end user's bill, doing peak shaving, maximizing how much solar you store, and then you can self-consume later on during the evening. And in terms of the use cases for V2G, the best ones will be when the vehicle has a long dwell time in a specific location. So Residential ticks that box where a vehicle is parked overnight at a person's home. Fleet and fleet charging that is depot-based, where service vehicles or delivery vehicles, for example, come back and are parked overnight at a depot. Workplace charging, where employees might be parked at their office for 8 hours in the day. As well as on the heavy-duty side, bus routes, public city buses, if they're not operating at nighttime and they're charging at the depot, school buses, great example, waste collection vehicles as well. And V2G in all of these cases helps with different types of issues that these customers might have. So for example, a residential customer might be most concerned with just minimizing their electricity bill or integrating the solar that they have with their EV in the home. Whereas a fleet operator might be facing, as I've seen in some projects with commercial fleets, constraints on grid connections, especially if they're sort of smaller delivery vehicles that are in urban areas near city center. There's constrained grid connections, and V2G really helps manage that. And then on the larger fleets that we're looking at and we've been working with, it's really, these technologies are very useful to improve the TCO by adding extra earnings from some grid services participation. And that really helps the overall economics of going electric for these fleets. Now, just a quick note for in practice. Is it possible today for everyone, a consumer or a fleet operator, to adopt these technologies? For V2G, you'll need the compatible vehicles, as I've mentioned. Today, they're the ones that belong to the specific standard CHAdeMO, but more and more electric vehicles are actually coming out with bidirectional functionality. For example, Volkswagen announced some, I believe, Honda E are bidirectional. So that's the first step. Second is to get a V2G charger. You have a few that are shown here, but for V2G specifically, you will need a specific charger. And who is offering this today and to go to? Well, one interesting port of call is to go to the Innovate UK, the government-funded trials, who are still, some of them are still recruiting participants, and they offer sort of subsidized chargers and subsidized offers to trial out these technologies. Or if you ask your energy supplier, most likely they will have some of this on offer. For example, the leading ones here are EDF Energy, OVO Energy, and Octopus, who are all quite active in this area. And these have actually come out with fully commercial offers for vehicle to grid that are available today, where you get, for example, cash back at the end of the month for the services that you provide. But clearly, these technologies are still fairly early stage, and there's still big barriers to adoption. I mentioned the one about compatible vehicles and chargers. Of course, on the economic side, the business model is often complex to explain to the end user. It's also, it varies a lot from one user to another, one fleet with a certain behavior or pattern versus another. And so this makes recruitment of customers particularly difficult. And another question and sort of challenge for this technology to be accepted is around battery warranty, and whether the V2G will have an impact on battery degradation. And it has been hard to tell, to give firm answers to this question in the past, but there is more and more data that's coming out of the recent trials. For example, one of the trials that has been running for over 4 years with EVs in Denmark, doing frequency response for the network, has shown that there's very minimal degradation to the batteries that is due to V2G. And actually, most of battery degradation comes from just the passing of time, calendar aging. And V2G has a very minimal impact. And finally, I think a topic that that Luke will be touching upon in more detail, data privacy, and are people going to be okay with having a third party take control of their vehicle and perhaps access to some extent their travel patterns and information. And that was it for me. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, we do have one question actually before we swap over. How might we see vehicle to grid act as an enabler for EV development? I think you partially, well, you covered some of that in the benefit of V2G, but I didn't know if there was anything further you wanted to say.
So do you mean in terms of enabling the growth of the EV market in general?
It wasn't my question, but let's say yes.
Yeah, well, definitely vehicle to grid. I think the main way that it can really help stimulate the rest of the EV markets is probably in the fleet sector, where there's very large costs associated with going electric. Adopting, electric buses or electric trucks, for example, and really having this additional, an additional stream of income coming from maybe 4 to 5 hours of balancing services that are operated overnight, that really don't disturb the pattern of use at all of these vehicles. That's where I think, yeah, it can really helps stimulate it, and just by lowering the overall cost of ownership.
Brilliant, that's really helpful. I can see that we've had another question come in, but in view of timing, I think we'll swap now to Luke, and then if we have time at the end, we'll come back to answer this additional question that's been asked. But thank you very much, Claire, for that. That was brilliant. So you do have another poll in front of you, so I'll just give you half a minute to do your quick answers, and then we're going to hand over to, as I say, Luke Dixon, who's a partner at Freeths in the data protection team.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Thanks very much for your time and attention this morning. I'd just like also to give my vote of thanks to the preceding speakers for their insightful and illuminating talks on their respective subjects. So yes, I'm a partner specialising in data protection, lucky me, at Freeths, working out of Freeths London office when that is allowed. And my talk hopefully neatly segues from something that Claire mentioned in her talk. That is the issue of data protection and cybersecurity in relation to EV vehicle charging. And so I'll be looking at some of the issues around that over the next 10 to 15 minutes to give you a high level idea of the issues. So as the agenda says, we'll be looking at how GDPR in particular is relevant to the EV charging ecosystem. Also, for those less familiar with GDPR, we'll be looking into a little bit of background, but I promise not too much background in terms of GDPR principles. And then we'll be seeing how, if you're a data controller and the obligations are primarily on you to comply with GDPR, how you might comply with that. But I think also on the flip side, hopefully this talk will also be useful if you are an end user, or maybe your employees are end users and you want to get an idea of the kind of things that the data controller you're entering into arrangements with, the kind of things that they should be doing in order to be compliant with GDPR and looking after your data and having an understanding of either your rights or maybe the rights of your employees, for instance. And then we'll be rounding up with some key takeaways at the end of my section. So first of all, how is GDPR relevant to the EV charging ecosystem? And I think the main reason why it may well be relevant is that parties to the ecosystem, such as charge point providers, OEMs and energy supply companies, may well all process personal data as part of the services they provide, and the way that they just generally process data. And personal data is very broadly, pretty broadly defined under GDPR. It's information from which you can identify a natural person or individual, or a piece of data that, if fused together with another piece of information you might be able to use then to identify them as well. So quite a broad range of data can be potentially personal data. And we've got some examples on the slide. So you might, for instance, be collecting the contact details of end users, or the payment and transaction details, or indeed, where we're talking about charge points, the location of the end user, where they're using the charge point, vehicle numbers, MPAN numbers, and things like that. So other things from which you could directly identify the end user, or as an end user you might be identified, or things that you can put together to build up a picture of the person or the end user. And so these parties will collect and process personal data for a number of purposes. It might be, for instance, contractual performance with the end user in order to provide the service to them, processing payments in return for the provision of the services, management of the end user customer relationship. If you're an OEM or a supplier, indeed a charge point provider, you will also maybe want to crunch personal data in order to see ways in which you might be able to provide, improve your business, or improve the services and develop the products. And also, if you're sort of presiding over the overall network and you want to understand better how the network's being used, you might also be analysing data in order to sort of understand better how the network's being used, and also improve efficiencies and performance in that regard as well. So really the point here is that these parties will quite likely be data controllers under GDPR, and a data controller is basically an entity which makes the decisions about why personal data is processed and what for. And when we talk about processing, that's a very widely defined term as well. It's basically anything you can do with personal data. So if you are a controller and you're deciding how to process personal data, you will have obligations under GDPR. And if you're an end user and your personal data has been processed, you will be a data subject, and you will have certain rights and expectations of the controller under GDPR too. So let's look into a little bit of background, some of the key concepts in GDPR that as a controller you need to be thinking about. The first one is transparency. So we've all seen, I'm sure, been bombarded, particularly over the last couple of years, with updated privacy notices and so forth. So the first thing you need to do is that where you're collecting and processing end user personal data or individuals' data, you need to be telling them what you're going to do with it, and you can express that, for instance, through a privacy notice. And that transparency has to be around things like what you'll use it for, what your lawful basis is, who you'll be sharing it with, how long you'll be keeping it for, security issues, and all these kind of things. The next thing that you also need to make sure you have in place is a lawful basis, because your processing of the personal data needs to be fair and lawful. So you need to basically pick a lawful ground under GDPR to process the personal data. And you've got a number of choices which may be applicable in a given scenario. So for instance, you can pick maybe consent sometimes, or your legitimate business interests is quite a commonly used one. It's quite a flexible ground. Or where you need the data to perform the contract, you can use contractual performance, or less likely, I suppose, possibly, if you're legally obliged or obligated to process the data, you may do so under a legal obligation. And those will be your stated lawful bases in a privacy notice and on your records, processing the data. Next thing to think about is security and data breaches, because this is issues around security of the network and individual personal data that you're processing will be important in this field. And basically, you should ensure that you can keep the data secure using appropriate security measures. And GDPR is not actually very prescriptive about the measures that you need to implement, but you need to be taking into account things like the state of the art of the technology and cost, and what the data is as well that you're processing, in order to put something in place, procedures, technologies, etc., to make sure that the system is looking after the data and keeping it secure and available and things like that, as far as is possible. And if it all goes wrong, then GDPR's got quite stringent requirements on reporting data protection breaches as well. So the typical period for reporting a data breach, once you've identified it, is 72 hours. So important to be able to recognize the breach when it happens and to have procedures in place to report it. data subject rights. So, the end users, individuals, the drivers, etc., will be handing over their personal data. They have rights too, and they're more, people are more aware of their GDPR rights and quite more militant about them, I think, really these days too. So, they will have rights about, accessing their data, right to be forgotten, things like that, rectification, erasure, restriction of processing. So just as people will be able to exercise those rights against the controller, as a controller, you'd need to be able to identify and respond to those requests as well in a timely fashion. And another key one is data sharing and transfers. So, parties to this ecosystem will all be entering into arrangements with each other, either to share data as controllers, so they pool the data to make their own decisions about the data in question, or maybe where they're using a service provider themselves, which will be a processor. And GDPR says that where, say, you're appointing a service provider to process data on your behalf, you need to make sure you have certain terms in place. And it's also prudent to have terms in place if you're sharing data as controllers, particularly if you're joint controllers. Again, GDPR mandates certain things in that area too, around data subject rights, and also around dealing with transparency and providing privacy notices too. And lastly, if you're transferring data out of the user data out of the EEA for whatever reason, you need to be able to legitimize that transfer too, because GDPR places a prima facie ban on that happening. And that's something of a hornet's nest really politically, because particular issues around exporting data to the US, where we had a recent decision that's knocked out the EU-US Privacy Shield, which was quite a popular way of legitimizing transfers from the EEA to the US. So how we've set up the issues, and we've seen how parties might be controllers and processors and data subjects. So, if you are a controller, you're a part in the ecosystem, how can you comply with GDPR and other information laws? Well, taking the issues one by one. Firstly, you can ensure transparent processing by making privacy notices and fair processing information easily accessible. And that's really the key thing here. So one way you might be able to do that is obviously having a comprehensive policy maybe on your website, because then that makes it publicly available. But equally, if you're doing something particularly novel with data, you should also be putting privacy notices, or at least brief notices, at points at which you collect personal data, and sort of really bringing that sort of key information to the user's attention before you then collect it and process it. You also need to be able to identify a lawful basis for all your uses of personal data. So I've got a couple of examples here, which I've seen looking through the industry. So for instance, consent is quite commonly used where you're sharing specific data with specific third parties. So for instance, usage data. But consent might not always be the right lawful ground to use. It's quite clunky. You need to give people the right to withdraw. You've got to record it. And there are high standards around the wording for consents as well. So you might also want to think about legitimate interests, which is commonly used where you want to improve products or services, or manage financial transactions, or your relationship with end users. And lastly, another commonly used one is contractual performance, where you need the data basically to fulfill the terms of the contract with the end user. And what about keeping data secure? Well, as I said, really, you need to think about and implement appropriate technical and organizational measures to guard against things like fraud, sabotage of the grid, and so forth. And the GDPR is not prescriptive about what you need to do, but some of the things you might need to think about are password authentication, appropriate access control and setting at levels, who really needs to know the information, have access to it. Encryption is commonly used, an important one. And also thinking about either anonymizing the data, which takes it out of the GDPR regime entirely, or maybe at least pseudonymizing it, which gives an extra layer of protection because it can't be readily identified. And it's not just GDPR that weighs in on security. We've also got things in the UK such as the NIS regulations. So that will have requirements about keeping, for instance, the system secure if it's a critical utility system, or indeed if you're a digital service provider within that as well. I spoke about data subject rights. So if I'm a data subject and I'm an end user, I might want to know things about how to access my data, for instance, in a data subject access request. And so the things as a controller you need to be getting in place are procedures and the ability to quickly and efficiently search your systems for the relevant data, be able to retrieve that relevant data, and also then to enact, unless an exemption applies, the data subject's request, be it provision of the data to the data subject, or maybe erasing it or correcting it or transferring it maybe to a third party, really depending on what the data subject, the end user, is asking you to do with that data. And where you're sharing personal data with a third party, say it's processors or controllers, service providers, etc., you need to be considering what the roles are between the two parties. Are you both controllers, or are you controller processor? Because then that will determine the kind of terms you need to put into place. So as I said, GDPR Article 28 says you need to put quite prescriptive about provision of terms between controllers and processors. Article 26 of GDPR has a slightly different requirements, where it's two joint controllers have the same pool of data and now doing things for the same kind of purpose as well, and have co-designed how to process the data. And then you also need to be thinking about how to legitimize any data transfers you make outside of the EEA. So commonly used solution is standard contractual clauses, which are basically EU approved clauses, model clauses, which are non-negotiable and which you can append to contracts. So they're still used. They're slightly vulnerable in view of recent case law, but they are still probably the best, most practical bets. Or if you're passing data amongst a multinational company and internationally, you may well want to consider, already have, binding corporate rules in place which sort of govern how the personal data is to be processed and used. So those are a couple of quite commonly used examples there, things you might think about. So we've gone through high level scoot through, if you like, of the parties involved, responsibilities, rights and key issues, and what you might need think about in terms of responding to those obligations and rights. Really the key takeaways I think here are that parties in the charging ecosystem may well collect and process personal data, and to the extent they do, the GDPR will place obligations on parties that are controllers, and indeed end users will have rights as regards their personal data against controllers. So if you're a controller, you can comply with GDPR and other UK information laws by being transparent, by processing the data fairly and lawfully, making sure your systems and data are secure and that you can report breaches, being able to act upon individual rights in an efficient, timely manner, and also sharing any personal data to the extent that you do so with third parties on appropriate terms and using appropriate safeguards. So thank you very much for your time. I hope that's been helpful. And I pass over, I think now is it to Kirsten, in case you've got any questions at the end of this talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lou. In fact, I can see that there's a question for you. It's what types of data are available currently or can be available for the purpose of data analytics?
Well, I think that probably depends on, it might depend on the kind of data that's collected in a given scenario, what you really choose to collect. But I think it's probably things like usage data quite often of the system. A lot of analysis, I think, is around how many people are using the system, where they're using the system. So it might be location data, the amount of data that's being used, etc. And that data might be personal to the extent that you can build up a picture about someone, maybe from where actually they're using the data. So if you've got a charge point at home, that might be personal because you can identify where that person lives, for instance, and then fuse it with other data. So I'd say things like usage, things like maybe the vehicle, where it's being located, and then by analysing that kind of data, you can build up a picture of the overall usage of the system, and then make decisions about how best to deploy the system from there. Sometimes, though, of course, you might, parties, controllers might, who are analysing that data, might try to take it out of the GDPR regime by trying to anonymise or to aggregate it. So they basically have a data set which doesn't really drill down into, into individuals, but generalises things sufficiently such as you can't identify individual persons from it.
Brilliant, thank you. Now, we do have a couple of minutes, literally a couple of minutes. So there were a few more questions. Let's go back to one asked earlier, which would be for Claire. Are there concerns about impact on battery life, especially if someone else is in control of your battery from time to time? Does it affect battery warranty?
Yes, I think I answered it in writing, but maybe just for the rest of the group. So we need more data from actual trials and experimentation with these services to really have a firm answer on the degradation impact. But so far, the data that's come from recent trials shows that there's very limited degradation that's due to the vehicle to grid like cycling impacts. And that most of the degradation is just due to general calendar aging. So with just passing of time. And some studies have found that there can be actually an improvement in battery health and battery lifetime with vehicle to grid because the battery is being managed in a smart way rather than having the user do things that are, for example, bad for it, like wait till it gets completely empty and then recharge it up at maximum power all the way to full, and do that on a regular basis is actually much worse for the battery than what the vehicle to grid service provider might do with it.
Interesting.
Which is a bit like the iPhone has a new feature of sort of smart charging and optimizing the charge of the phone. Which is sort of the same concept. Someone else takes control to improve that. And then on the warranty side, it will be, I guess, on an OEM per OEM basis. Nissan at the moment is pretty much the main manufacturer of vehicle to grid compatible cars, and they do validate the warranty for this application.
Excellent, thank you. Maybe one last question. I know we've got more to be answered, but as I said at the beginning, we will send out the written responses. So one, just going back to you, Natasha, just briefly going back to the first part of the presentation, what is the best suited vehicle use type for H2 fuel cell deployment?
Yeah, so I think heavy goods vehicles are the most useful for hydrogen, I think, at this point. For light commercial vehicles and so cars and vans, I think there's already a lot of investment that have gone in from the automotive manufacturers and the OEMs, and all of the charging infrastructure as well, which is, I think the last time I checked the stat, 300 billion of investment had gone in from the automotive manufacturers. And in the UK alone, we need something like 75 billion of infrastructure investment, which is still pending. But the sums is basically obviously very large. And I think that once that investment has gone in for light duty vehicles, we're going to see that technology stay for them. I think where there's more technology uncertainty is in heavy goods vehicles, and therefore I think hydrogen would be best deployed as a possible solution there. And I mentioned alongside energy if possible, which makes it even more efficient and advantageous to the way that we produce a hydrogen economy, which is, for example, what Japan is looking at developing.
Thank you. So as I say, we will answer all the questions, but we'll send those out after this session. This was our last 2020 Green Breakfast webinar, but we're already planning our next series for spring 2021, so keep tuned. Results of the poll will be circulated along with the recording and the slide desk in the next few days or at the beginning of next week. And so I will bring this session to an end, and thank you again to all of our speakers, and thank you to all of you who've attended today. Thank you.